guys, it's Dave Barnett from the investlocalbook.com blog site. As most of you know who are following this blog, I recently moved from my apartment that I've been in for the last 2.5 years to my new surplus military home that I bought in the sealed tender process. And you know, when I was emptying out that apartment, it brought back a lot of memories for me of the period of my life when I used to be a real estate investor. I used to own several income properties. I had a whole bunch of apartments, and I wanted to tell that story because I know some of you have asked questions about my past and my experiences and things. So here's the story of David Barnett as a real estate investor, and it started at the end of 2004. I happened to read Rich Dad's Cash Flow Quadrants. I believe it was Robert Kiyosaki's second book, where he explains the cash flow quadrants and starts talking about leveraging. And I had reached a point where I knew that I wanted to leave my career at the Yellow Pages, and I actually started to make a list of the things that I needed to do before I quit my job. And one of those things was getting mortgages, because obviously if you don't have a regular income, it's hard to qualify for a mortgage. So I had been very successful, and let me backtrack a little bit here. I had been very successful at the Yellow Pages, and I was earning over $100,000 a year. And I had bought my first house in 2001, and real estate prices here are not that high, and this was before they became inflated by the 2000s real estate bubble. So I actually bought an old wartime story-and-a-half home. It was a 2-bedroom home, but it had a nice loft above the garage, which became my office. I bought that place in 2001 for $67,000 or $68,000, and I made extra payments all the time. And so by the fall of 2004, I had actually paid off that mortgage. So I went to the bank and I got a home equity line of credit, and I went out and I started looking for rental properties to buy. And I bought 2 triplexes within a 2-week period using the equity line of credit to make my down payments. So I was putting down 25% on each building that I bought, and I believe I bought one for about $130 and one for about $139. So that's 2 triplexes. So I had 6 units at that time, and I went to work as a landlord, and I started to rent apartments, and I started to learn the ins and outs of collecting from tenants and the legalities of kicking someone out, and the best practices as far as, you know, renting apartments and leases and all that kind of thing. It was also one of the first times in my life that I experienced buyer fever. One of the 2 triplexes that I wanted to buy, when it was originally presented to me, there was no expense there for electricity, and I assumed that the tenants paid for their own electricity. And just before closing, my realtor informed me that there were 4 electrical accounts at the building. Every apartment paid for their own electricity, but there was a house account, as they call it, for the hallways and the hot water heater. Now, I was so happy about the deal I had made, I didn't think to look into it any further. I figured, well, a hot water heater and a couple of lights, how bad could it be? Well, I'll tell you how bad it was. Here where I live, the electrical utility is regulated by the province, and it's owned by the province. And so there are different electrical rates based upon who you are. So residences pay a much better rate than businesses. And since there's 3 apartments in the apartment building, the power company will only allow 3 of the accounts to be qualified for the residential rate. So my account, which had the hot water heater, had to be covered under the business rate, which was 2.5 times higher than the power rate for residences. So I was getting power bills for hot water and the lights in the hallway and the coin-op washer and dryer, sometimes $300 a month. Basically, almost ate up all the cash flow. Now, the other thing that I did wrong about being a landlord is I fooled myself into subsidizing the buildings with my own labor. So I would go and mow the lawns, I would go and do handyman things, I would go and do minor fix-ups and repairs, I would go and make sure that nobody left trash out behind the building. And what this meant was that I was losing hours of my life to get that cash flow every month and fooling myself into thinking that that was profit. Later on, after a couple of years when I got children, when my ex and I were together and we had 2 children, I didn't have time anymore for that kind of thing. And so I outsourced that stuff to a property management firm. And when I had to pay their bills, it gave me a truer picture of what the cash flow scenario was like for those buildings. Now, after those 2 buildings, 2 years later, I then bought a fourplex. I picked that one up for like $137,000 because it needed to work. Now I had 10 apartments. And then eventually when, after my first daughter was born, we moved to a larger home and I rented out my old house, that old one I bought for 68 grand, and I sold that one on a lease option deal. I did a different video about that. But now we're starting to talk about getting into 2008, 9, 10. In 2009, I sold my first building. This is when interest rates were getting very low and the value of these properties was starting to go up way more than what I would have ever have paid to own them. So I started to sell, and this was when I started to come face to face with liquidity risk. And I talk a little bit about liquidity risk in my book, Invest Local. But when you're a real estate investor and you read all these books about real estate investing and you watch the gurus on the internet and things, you start to think about equity as though it's real money. So my biggest building, I knew that I could probably sell it for about 180 grand. And at that time, I think I owed about 130. So it's very easy to fool yourself into thinking, hey, I have 50 grand tied up in that building. In 2011, my business brokerage wasn't doing so well and I needed to get my hands on cash. And it was the same year that I decided to get out of business brokerage. And I had to sell one of my buildings rather quickly. And I was faced with paying a realtor. I was faced with the legal fees. I was faced with the mortgage adjustment penalty because I had signed in term contracts at a certain interest rate and the prevailing rate had gone down below that. So I remember one of my buildings I sold that I believed I had $50,000 of equity in. I think I walked away with like a 31 grand or 32 grand. And it was a real eye-opener to the fact that there's incredible friction in the market when you decide to sell one of these properties. Huge learning experience for me. As interest rates went down and the values went up, I eventually sold all 3 of the buildings, and the people who were doing the lease option on my old home eventually exercised that option as well, and I got completely out of real estate. And if I look back at those years, I realized that it was exciting, it was an adventure. We never really got the appreciation in prices here that people experienced in other places. But just from a cash flow point of view, investing 30 or 40 grand as a down payment and then borrowing another 100, 120 grand of leverage to produce a cash flow of a couple $100 a month, I began to realize it just wasn't worth it. It was too much to put on the line to produce a couple $100 of cash flow. And it was around that same time that I was starting to perfect my own methodology for doing loans and leases and things. And I realized with far less money at a good rate of return, I could produce the same kind of cash flow with truly a more manageable scenario. When I lend someone money in a small business investment loan, I'm not getting calls about toilets. I'm not getting calls about broken doors. I'm not getting calls about noisy neighbors or anything like that. It's very easy, straightforward. I collect the payment every month, and if something goes wrong, I have to manage it. But apart from one real estate deal, I haven't had any of these smaller loans or investments go bad. So that is my experience as a real estate investor. I was in those buildings from 2005, got out of the last one in 2011. So over a 6-year period, I did that. and it truly was a formative experience. I think that if I ever get back into real estate, I will want to do it from a much stronger equity position, and I will want to make sure that I have a manager in place. What I mean by that is have like 50% down to put on one of these buildings. And I think that that day is going to come when interest rates start to move back up. When interest rates move up and the value of these buildings moves down, I believe that a lot of them are going to get foreclosed on by people, by banks upon people who are overextended. And that will be when a real opportunity will arise to get into these rental properties. Anyway, if you enjoyed my video and if you enjoy my other videos, please make sure that you go to investlocalbook.com and sign up for my email mailing list. That's where all my best stuff is delivered. If you want to learn how to do small local investment deals, you should buy my book, Invest Local, and you should also take the course, How to do small local investment deals from A to Z, which is also available from my blog site, investlocalbook.com. Thanks. We'll talk to you later.